Welcome to the Newsmakers Podcast. I'm Billy Hollowell, and this is a show where we go behind the headlines every day to bring you an interview with a pastor, entertainer, politician, or other notable news figure. And this is a show, again, it's daily, but it's based on our weekly TV show, which is also called Newsmakers. You can watch it on the CBN News channel and also on our YouTube page. And on this show, every day, we dive deep. It's a little more longer form with one of the people who you will often see on our Newsmakers show or across the CBN News platforms. On today's Newsmakers, Teona Pagan is joining us to talk about her battle for religious liberty. She claims she was fired after becoming a Christian, and her attorney, Christina Hauser, will also be joining us. With no further ado, here are Teona and Christina. Teona, you are currently in the middle of a lawsuit against City University of New York over the claim that you were wrongfully terminated for your faith. I want to get into the different pieces of that story, but let's start first with your position. What were you doing there at CUNY?
So I was working at City College, but within City College, I was working at the Colin Powell School for Civic and Global Leadership as the Fellowships and Public Service Program Coordinator. Just want to make sure everything's still good. Okay, you can still hear me? Everything's still, nothing freezing, right? Okay, cool. So yes. And I was in charge of, like I said, the Fellowships and Public Service Program Coordinator. And so I was responsible for allowing students to pursue their dreams through different fellowships. And so we had about 10 different fellowship programs where students were able to pursue internships, and we would bless them with fellowships. And so for more clarity, the difference between fellowships and scholarships is that scholarships is usually just like a check and just a one-off payment, but fellowships is more so programs. So we were in charge of, my job specifically was in charge of curating those programs to make sure that when the students were able to pursue those internships and those dreams and those goals, that we were able to not just give them a check to go do so, but we were able to curate a program behind whatever that interest was. And so that was my job.
So you have this job. You then, after getting the job, you become a Christian, correct? That's sort of the trajectory a few months after you came into that position?
Yes, I became more of a devout Christian, I'll say. I always believed in God, but definitely began running after him in April of 2022. More so March.
So once that happens, March of 22. Once you become a Christian, obviously, or when you become you become closer to your faith, let's word it that way, because you said you always believed, it starts to impact everything in your life, right? You start looking at things differently. You start saying, what are the things I'm doing, I'm thinking, I'm feeling, how do they align with God? And so I imagine you started going through that process, and there was one element of your job that, was affected by that. So talk a little bit about what happened when you started to realize maybe there wasn't a sync up between that piece of your position and your newfound faith?
Yeah, definitely. So around like March of 2022, I made the decision to make that bold choice to really choose Jesus and not just say, put a scripture in like a caption or something like that, but truly say I'm walking with the Lord. And so with that comes a lot of responsibility. I mean, he tells us to, deny ourselves, pick up our cross and follow after him. And so that comes with a lot of conviction, and that comes with a lot of ensuring that I lived by what I was preaching physically, and also preaching to the people I was speaking to, and also preaching to myself. And so if this big, this job I have was, there was a point in my life where I was like, okay, I'm out here like in my extracurricular time, I'm going to church, I'm being more devout, I'm volunteering, I'm doing all the things. But when I get to work, I'm not living up to it in the fullness. And so around that time, around April, it got the conviction of the Holy Spirit, the conviction on myself personally. It wasn't anybody specifically specifically telling me like, you need to do this, but it was an inward decision that I had in a relationship with God, where it's like, okay, I know that this is wrong. I know that homosexuality is wrong. And I know that I cannot continue to invest in students or people or anyone in particular, but especially the students that I had, being that I was a steward over those lives, those souls. I was a steward over them in some kind of a way. And so I didn't feel comfortable continuing to do that. And so, but it wasn't just I woke up one day and just decided to refuse to do my job. It was prayer, it was fasting, it was consulting with my spiritual leadership. It was a big decision
You were
because,
seeking
again,
God. You were seeking God for an answer, right? You were looking for, and so people understand you had at least 10, I believe, fellowships that you oversaw. Correct me if I'm wrong, but there was just one fellowship that fell into the LGBTQ community, and that was the one that you were looking for an exemption from, an accommodation from your employers, right?
yes, sir. I was seeking an accommodation for one fellowship out of the 10 that I oversaw. It was just one fellowship that I was seeking to be accommodated for. And I would also like to emphasize that, not to say that, every student of mine wasn't a part of that community, but for this specific fellowship, I did not want to be the one to allow them to I didn't want to be the one to invest into that part of their future. I didn't want to have to do something that I didn't morally agree with anymore. And again, prior to my salvation, and I was definitely an advocate, I was definitely an ally, and all those different things. I mean, it's documented that I was in protest, all these different things, the intersectionality of it all. But once I got saved, everything changed for me. And so I thank God for doing so. And I was like, okay, if possible, and I knew it was possible because that was such a small portion of my job, and I had other team members and I had other people on the job that would have been able to help me with that. And so, an accommodation, I didn't think that it would even get to this point. But they, unfortunately, my former employer sought to find fit that it wasn't possible because of the religious part of it, because it was relating back to the Christianity of it all. So physically, yes, it was possible to accommodate me, but because they did not agree with my Christian beliefs, here we are today.
So, Christina, I want to come to you in a moment, but one more question for you, Teona. So you go to them, you ask for this accommodation, you say, this is only 10% of what I'm doing, someone else can pick it up. I'm sure you said I could pick up other things, I'm going to use my time wisely, but I'm looking for this accommodation. Their reaction initially, take me through the trajectory of that back and forth, because obviously you were employed, you ask for this, and now we're talking and you're no longer employed. You had a loss of employment. So talk about what happened as you went to them asking for that accommodation.
So again, yes, after all the prayer and all the consulting of seeking God, I finally made the decision to speak to my manager first, my supervisor rather. So I spoke with her, which was not abnormal. We've had many conversations one-on-one and compromising, and we worked together. Although she was my supervisor, we worked together on a lot of different projects to make the students successful. And so this was just another day where I felt like, hi, would I be able to have a conversation with you? I need to talk to you about something. And so we had a conversation, and she was taken aback, and she was quite surprised by what I was asking. And she had a few questions, and I just explained briefly that I just felt like if I were investing in someone else to sin, basically, is I'm summing it up. But if I were to continue doing that, then God would hold me responsible, and I just didn't want to continue doing that. And then for more context too, as I began to grow and evolve in the Lord, it was evident, it was visible. I was not so much being so preachy at work, but I was expressing myself. I was expressing the fact that God was changing my life, and these different things where appropriate. Even for instance, like if my peers wanted to go out for drinks, I would tell them no. I would explain different things. And so there were opportunities before this conversation even happened to know that I am now a devout Christian. The scriptures on my office wall, and it was very clear that I was changing, that I was different. But I also didn't allow that to compromise the work that I was doing. And so spoke to my supervisor, and the next day she wanted to call me in again to get more clarity on what I asked. And then pretty much things were then expedited to the HR part of the human resources part of my job. And then for more clarity, for those that are not familiar with the CUNY system, I worked at City College. At City College, I was at the school within the school, which is the Colin Powell School, but I was employed by the Research Foundation of CUNY. And so my HR representative came from the Research Foundation of CUNY. And so I was emailed by him, and I was spoken to by him just to get more of a statement. And then just to speed things up, I didn't hear anything for a while. After I spoke to my the resources person, human resources person, I was pretty much in the dark for a while. Howbeit people were, I knew it's kind of like one of those things where, people are talking about you, but they don't want to say much. So it was a lot going on behind the scenes that I would hear this and hear that. But on the front end of things, I didn't get any response for about a couple weeks to a month. And then once that passed around the beginning of June, then things started picking up much quicker. I was called in for a virtual meeting with the dean and with the HR representative, and I was told to my face that that basically this would not be possible. The accommodation would be possible. I was able to present my case, present the Lord's position, and present the scripture that I had to go along with why I felt the way I did. And then as soon as that call was over, I got an email saying that I was denied my accommodation. And then a few days later, I was put on administrative leave. And then very, very soon after that, I was barred from entering the campus, and my position was terminated. So there was a lot of, in that period of time, I sped up a lot of things, but it was very stressful, very emotionally taxing. It was a lot going on. And I was just so, I definitely felt way more uncomfortable than I did before. I would go in my office and just have lunch, close the door, and then wouldn't really feel comfortable to even be around people anymore. There wasn't like anybody blatantly saying certain things, but the atmosphere completely shifted, especially considering like a lot of my peers and even my superiors, they're also in homosexual relationships. So it was just like a lot of like tension now that I openly professed that this was something I didn't agree with. But I also want to emphasize that the nature of, my character, I love all people as Jesus does. He loves all of us. He created all of us. But the things that he doesn't agree with, we also as Christians have to stand boldly for the things that he doesn't agree with. That's all of our sin. That's all of us when we fall short and when we go against what God says to do. And so when I was put in a position where I had to make a decision and say, okay, if I'm saying I'm going to be a Christian, then I have to live it, I have to breathe it, and I have to show it. And so I made that bold stance, and I'm boldly here talking about it today. So yeah.
Well, I appreciate you taking us through those details. Now, Christina, I have to come to you. As an attorney, what was your first reaction when you heard the details of this case?
Well, unfortunately, it's not surprising because there is a lot of hostility and retaliation against Christians in the workplace and just in the world generally these days. But I have to say, even listening to Teona right now, I'm just so proud of her because it's really a difficult thing to do, especially for a young person, but really for anybody to take a stand like this. And she's doing the right thing. And her employer clearly violated the law.
Well, and let's talk about that because, this is not a situation from what you're saying, where you were saying, okay, half of my job I'm giving up. It was a small portion of your job. It would seem, in your view, Christina, was there an undue burden in any way put on the employer by asking for this accommodation?
Absolutely not. And this is the go-to that employers use because it's the only exception that exists under the law to avoid affording reasonable accommodation. So in pretty much 100% of cases, this is what employers say. Oh, it posed an undue burden. But thankfully, the Supreme Court held just a couple of years ago that undue burden is not just a de minimis burden or just any burden. It's a substantial burden, and it's something that has to be proven in court with evidence. They're going to have to show that they actually went through an analysis, attempted to accommodate Teona, and just determined that this would impose substantial cost upon the employer, and they won't be able to meet that bar.
So right now we have a lawsuit. What is the timeline? What are sort of the next steps here? Because here Teona's speaking about this boldly. And by the way, before you even answer that, I will say anytime somebody comes forward with a case like this, first of all, there's challenging it. That's hard enough in itself and takes some boldness. But putting your name out there, being out there, you start to get reactions from people. And that is a difficult thing. And so I want to emphasize that it is a bold thing, regardless of what people think about your case out there, for you to be sharing what you believe, standing up and saying what you're saying. And so I just wanted to emphasize that. But Christina, what is the timeline on this case? What happens next?
Well, before we could even file this lawsuit, we had to go through the EEOC. It's called Exhausting Your Administrative Remedies. So that took a couple of years. So now we were issued a right to sue letter. We can file in court, and we did. And the next steps likely will be that the defendants will make a motion to dismiss, which is typically what happens in these cases. And we'll oppose that, obviously. And then it'll be in the hands of the judge to decide that. And the courts move very, very slowly. Assuming the case survives that, we'll move on to discovery, which will involve an exchange of documents and depositions, and then likely motions for summary judgment. And if there's no settlement, which most cases do settle, but if there's no settlement, then it will eventually proceed to trial.
Teona, when you ponder all you've been through in this and this current battle that you're really just heading into now, you're in the middle of it, but you're really heading into the harder parts of it. What are you hoping to see happen? What are you hoping to gain at the end of this?
The first thing I'm hoping for is salvation. I even in pursuing this, going into the conversation, if I think back to the very beginning with my supervisor, I didn't expect all this to happen. I didn't think it was going to escalate. I didn't think that it was going to be that big of an issue. And so even and then again, for context, when this all first happened, I was freshly out of the womb of Christ. Like I was a baby Christian. And I was also 21 at the time. I was extremely young and I was extremely tender, but I still had that bold youthful faith that really just drove me to really just want to fight for the rights of Christ. Like the ultimate goal for me is to allow somebody to say, what must I do to be saved? What must I do to be able to stand for what's right? There's a lot of propaganda. There's a lot going on in the world. And especially, again, going back to the youth, like I think it's encouraging if I step outside of myself for a second and think about, like, if I was reading an article about myself, like to see that, wow, this young lady, when I was terminated, I turned 22, but that's still a very, very young age to be walking into something of this magnitude, and then also doing it without the most support of a lot of people, because again, this is not just a small thing. The LGBT community is massive, and they have grown, especially if you think about the fact that our former president Barack Obama had signed into law that gay marriage is legal. So it's legally okay to commit sin against God. It's legally okay to do all these different things. And so, again, even prior to all this happening, and in my past life, I was an advocate for like Black Lives Matter. I was an advocate for all these different intersectional things that they have the face of social change, but behind it is sin and nothing but going against the word of God. And so I would encourage the youth to really just take a moment to just really seek the face of God. Again, this is truly just his case. This is truly just his case working through me, working through my Lord, Christina. And so I would just pray that the people that maybe even hear about it or read about it, or even watch this interview, that they'll be able to be inspired to want to follow Jesus and know that there is going to be victory. And even with victory looking like salvation, or somebody just saying, you know what, I understand what happened, and I really just want to give my life unto God. That's the ultimate goal. And of course, we want to be compensated for the trials and the hardship, but ultimately it's all about Jesus.
I want to emphasize something about your story that I think, you've brought it up a couple of times, and I don't want us to miss this here, because you in your past life, right? You said, Black Lives Matter, LGBTQ causes, protests, all of these, secular movements that, people feel are very well-intentioned, the people who are in them. And we can have a whole other, conversation about all of those different things, right? And what's going on there. But you had this change, and that change for you was Jesus, embracing Christ, and then a total life change. And here you are talking about that. I think that part of your story is incredible, and that you felt compelled to make a change in every way. And so, people can do with that what they want, but I do think that's a huge part of your story that people need to see, regardless of whether they're believers or non-believers, to understand that Jesus really did change you. And even what you said there is so important. At the end of the day, no matter what situation we're talking about or dealing with, people finding the Lord, that is the most important thing that anybody can discover and find. And so, Christina, just wanted to come back to you on this. How confident are you in legal victory on this case?
It's clear that the employers violated the law. However, the state of the law and the court system, especially in New York, is just terrible. So I can't say that I'm completely confident that we will have a legal victory. However, Teona is such an inspiration, and she clearly has I'm sure, planted seeds in the young people that she's worked with and people that will hear from her. And there will be an opportunity, even if we don't have a victory at the district court level, for us to appeal and potentially make new law and set precedent so that there will be clear legal barriers to people retaliating against people of faith in the workplace. So it's important that we take on this fight, both on the culture side and the legal side. And I'm just so honored and blessed to be a part of it.
Well, I want to thank you both for taking the time, coming on, breaking this down. We will continue to cover this story as new developments unfold. Thank you both.
Thank you.
Thank you for having us.
That's all for today's Newsmakers podcast. Be sure to tune in for the next episode of the show, and also head over to the CBN News YouTube channel and the CBN News channel to watch Newsmakers every week. We'll see you soon.